Hi, I'm Ben Folds. Today on the ArtsVote 2020 podcast series on arts and politics, Senator Mark Begich and I talk to presidential candidate Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Mayor Pete talks to us about how his school music program shaped a lifelong love of music and how that translated into his support today for numerous cultural initiatives as the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, including the lighted sculpture along the river that runs through the city. You may have seen it. This was a project funded by the National Endowment for the Arts, the NEA. He also tells us how, as president, he would show his public leadership in the arts to support both public and private giving to the arts. So let's listen to what Mayor Pete has to say.
Mayor Pete, let's start with the basics, and that is really, how has art played not only in your personal life, but maybe when you were mayor? How has arts and culture been part of the equation?
Well, it's always been a part of my personal life. Growing up playing music, growing up surrounded by the arts. My mom was a photographer and an artist, and I think that just kind of enriched my upbringing. But it was when I became mayor that I came to really understand just how much good it can do as part of how community meets its civic aims. We are living in a moment when there's a real struggle for things we have in common. There's a real struggle for unity, and in particular, things we can appreciate that cut across political or other tribal boundaries. And a big part of how you do that is that there's a common, deep, innate human appreciation for beauty. And, arts has so much to do with presenting beauty, sometimes presenting stories, things that unite people or at least can cut across these divisions. So, for example, a very simple sounding thing, but really important in the life of our city. We had a 150th anniversary celebration, and part of it, and it's great to be reunited with Ben Folds, was Ben came and did a concert, and
you guys played together.
That's right. Yeah, it was probably the highlight of my
Was he an additive, or
uh,
did he add to you, Ben?
Well, that's the only time I can think of that I've stood and someone else played the piano. It's a first for me. Yeah.
I didn't interrupt your story there.
No,
but
it was great. We had thousands of people. They loved it, and so at a performance to kind of bring at a moment when our city was just coming to believe in itself again after decades of just taking it on the chin industrially. Another thing we did, though, is we said we want to have something in addition to the celebrations we have on this occasion. We want to have something that lasts, and so we raised the money to put in a light sculpture. It's kind of hard to describe, but it's a beautiful thing. We launched it that day, and it illuminates in this kind of series of colors this cascade on the river that gives our city its name. And what we found since is it's a touchstone. Different people from different sides of the city and different backgrounds and different neighborhoods, different races, all love to come look at this very beautiful spot in our city. And so this piece of visual art has allowed for a city that sometimes has a lot of forces that are threatening to divide us to have this thing in common. And symbols can do that, stories can do that, performances can do that, visual art can certainly do that. So I've learned that that's very much part of your repertoire when you're governing, is to make sure that the people you serve have access to that.
What's the most recent arts event that you've been to? What's kind of that thing that sticks most recently in your mind? I know you've been on the trail, but...
Well, yeah, we've had a lot of great performances come through South Bend. Don't get a lot of time to attend them, but once in a while we sneak off, and Les Mis has a great touring production that came through South Bend that we had a great time with, but also some local stuff going on. We got a group that took an old dry cleaning facility. They kind of moved out, but the owner wants it to go to civic use, and basically converted it for different spaces, different sort of chambers in this really interesting, kind of strange space to be turned into art installations. And it drew people, again, from very different parts of our community to come check it out, and has become just another part of South Bend's story.
Ben, you have been with the American for the Arts, but the Action Fund now, and it was a couple of years ago when you had a chance to play with the mayor. Politicians and musicians, it's an interesting combination at times. But what was that like, and did it give you some insight on how public policy and merging arts can make a difference in our country?
Well, it was an interesting experience because, I do share the stage with politicians sometimes. This was uniquely different with Pete because he's a really good musician, but also because the event had a real sense of, your presence on the stage was not so much like a politician presence I'm used to. It was like a beloved entertainer or someone that they knew had hit the stage. So it did have a very unifying feeling to it. It doesn't appear to me to look historically back to, say, Kennedy and Johnson. They seem to be the last ones who had a real effect. I may be wrong, but I can't see any other evidence of real effect on the arts, and that they brought the NEA came into existence at that time. From then on, whoever the president is, the NEA seems to get less or more funding at an almost random rate, which indicates to me that the president has a difficult position in guiding the arts. And I feel like your angle is uniquely future, without using the word that much, which is interesting. Same with unity, like a lot of unification, not a lot of using the word literally. What can a president do in that, looking forward the way that you do to the year that you'll be the same age as the current president? What can a president do to help guide the importance of the arts and to actually put it into play either through policy or symbolism?
Yeah. Well, the way you frame that is the exact right one. I think there's kind of a set of policy tools, and then there's a bigger kind of cultural question. So on the policy front, as you said, a lot of times it just comes down to resources. So the reason it's hard to think of anything as impactful as the NEA is that unleashed so many resources that then went out into our communities. And I think as a policy matter, we've got to make sure that we continue to build up what amounts to a very important part of our national trust, our national identity, even our national security in a way, to be able to support the flourishing of the arts. I think it was John Adams who said the whole point of being involved in politics, right? He said, I must study politics and war that my sons might be at liberty to study more advanced things and so on. And that the top of the pyramid of civilization, once you take care of everything from clean, safe drinking water to making sure you don't get attacked by a foreign country, the whole point of all that is to build up to the kind of crowning achievements of civilization, which so often come from the arts. I think right now a lot of this, in terms of the policy conversation, cashes out in the education piece, right? So there's a debate about how we maintain our national competitiveness. And we think about, take, for example, artificial intelligence, the rise of automation, and all the changes that means for the workforce. At one level, we're recognizing correctly that we've got to do a lot of technical education to get people ready for all these changes. But what I think we're missing is, the biggest thing that's going to change is the pace of change itself. In other words, no matter how well I get trained in some particular kind of machining, I can rely on the fact that 3, 5, or 7 years from now, something new is going to be asked of me. And so the things that are going to matter even more than specific technical skills are things like problem solving, social and emotional learning, dealing with people, because something that is a repeatable physical task in the workplace is probably going to get automated away. But looking for patterns, dealing with exceptions, handling ambiguity, these are the things you still need people for, whether we're talking about a factory floor, or whether we're talking about a McDonald's, or whether we're talking about a law firm. And that means that arts education is not a luxury, especially when you also consider the fact that we're not just bringing up workers, we're bringing up citizens. So those are some examples where I think resources need to be brought to bear through policy in order to make sure that we have flourishing arts in this country. But the other side is that symbolic piece. Just, do we have a White House that celebrates the arts? And we've seen examples of that from Kennedy's famous sort of salon culture in the East Room, to the fact that I think the first time most people were exposed to the body of work that became Hamilton was at a White House convening where they brought together people to perform. And so the way I did it back home was just to get up and play the piano. It's not that I'm a better pianist than most of the people you could pay and see, but it was enough of a novelty to see the mayor do it and do it competently that it kind of brought more people probably than there would have been otherwise. If only for the reasons people go to a tightrope act to see if you're going to fall off. But there was some suspense to it, right?
Yeah, there was for me, and you killed it, by the way.
You mentioned education, and one of the big issues I know the Action Fund is interested in, and I think a lot of people are. I know I was when I was mayor, that education is a big part of it, and there's always a big push for STEM education, science, technology, engineering, math. but there's a bigger push to add arts in that. They call it STEAM because of the impact that arts can have across all those disciplines. Give us some of your thought on how you see, as a president, give us a sense of how you think that and what you feel about that. I think
philosophically, the big thing we got to do is break down the idea that this is a luxury.
Right.
Art and performance and music has always been meaningful for everybody, from the people who go to the $100,000 plate museum benefit in the biggest city to somebody who's got nothing in life but a harmonica and figures out a way to use it, and everything in between. And so we got to recognize that this is something that is at every level of our society, and that it enhances our capacities in all the things you can count. There's a lot of evidence that we're better at the STEM fields if we've had some musical training. And so there's a practical benefit. But also, in many ways, this is the point. I mean, you measure a society's achievements based largely on what it creates. And so if we're doing well as a country, we should be generating a kind of creative output that helps lead the world. And you think about also at a moment when our place in the world is kind of precarious, when it's not as obvious as it used to be that the American model is going to be the leading one in the world. You think back to the importance of culture just as much as the importance of our military apparatus, for example. The fact that you had a lot more Soviets trying to get their hands on cassette tapes of American performers than the other way around played a big role in us winning the Cold War. And I think as we look into the 21st century and ask how American leadership is going to be sustained, arts is really a big part of that. And so it goes to education. It also is important at a moment when I think critical thinking is important to our ability to function as citizens. I remember being in a conversation somewhere back home, and people were talking about the future of education, and somebody said, you got these Chinese students running circles around our students, and I promise you they're not sitting around reading Hemingway. And I was thinking, well, okay, but if they were reading Hemingway and other things, maybe they wouldn't be as content to live in an authoritarian society. So, we need critical thinking in our capacity, yes, as workers, but also in our capacity as citizens, so we make good choices in the public square.
I know one of the issues, and Ben, we've talked about it before with the fund, and that is the National Endowment for the Arts. I mean, it's been average, I think, $155 million, give or take, funding. If you adjusted for inflation over the time, it'd be over $350 million today, just to keep even. There's been an idea you've kicked around, others have kicked around, of $1, I think, per capita.
$1 per capita.
Yeah, that make that kind of a baseline. And I guess, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, Ben, or you want to respond. I mean, I that's an interesting idea.
I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, I feel like it's a matter, something that's easily understood, digestible, as you say. I mean, one I tried to use to explain to maybe music fans is that, for perspective, is that in about 20 minutes, the NEA is paid for if you're spending equally for the rest of the year. So in 20 minutes, we pay for our arts.
When this podcast is done.
When this podcast is done, we're finished paying for the arts, and the clock will run out for the whole rest of the year paying for all the other stuff it takes to keep the government open. That's very little, and it's not going to kill arts to not fund it. People are artistic, and we do it anyway. My concern is that we don't understand the importance of unlocking the arts for the economy and education, critical thinking, that we need to kind of, my feeling in talking to a lot of fans is the misunderstanding is we're asking for a handout so that people can make stuff. And especially maybe it's an elitist thing that you're making, or you're going to dance in someone's face in the street, or something that's confronting. But they don't think about that music is all about communication. And there's nothing more important than that.
It's an investment. This amount of money is an investment.
So to me, the dollar per head is the government people coming together and saying this is important. Just the symbolism of it being something that you can put your finger on. That's not it's not frivolous. It's important. So to me, that's a big thing. And it with inflation and population increase, it's just a damn shame that it has really gone down so much. And so we definitely need our presidential candidates to, I think, stand up for. I mean, I would love to see a dollar per. $2 would be. I'm a musician, but we can live with $1.
I think that's great. It also parallels the percent for art idea that a lot of cities and local communities have come up with, which I think is great. maybe this is just my orientation as a mayor, but I think we're living in a moment where a lot of the energy and a lot of the action comes from outside Washington, right? And you see how different communities are rising to meet this challenge, partly because we haven't been as able to count on Washington for resources as a previous generation might have. And what you see happening in a lot of communities, and I'm hoping we can get South Bend there too, is that when there's a big infrastructure project, I don't know who started this. It might have started in Norway, but it's definitely happening in a lot of local cities around the U.S. You're building a bridge. It's going to be a certain amount to build the bridge. You set aside 1% of that project budget, and that's going to go into art, whether it's an art feature related to the bridge, or whether it's something that goes into a fund that the community can decide what to do with. That as you do that, it's just intuitive. A percent doesn't seem like much, but if you add that up out of all the spending that goes on, it's enough to really build up a really rich texture of artistic life in a specific place. So I think when you break it down like that, percent of a project, $1 per person per year in this country, it's a little more intuitive that, why wouldn't we do that?
The interesting thing, one of the challenges when you put this kind of money, let's say the Endowment for the Arts, $150 million, give or take right now, it leverages out a lot of money. One of the things that occurred in the last tax initiatives that were done under the Trump administration was they changed the way charitable contributions work. So if you're middle class, you don't get the deductibility unless you do. You don't get deductibility. If you're wealthy, you get that deductibility in a larger percentage for donating to the arts. Do you think tax policy has a role in helping invest and promote in the arts, or is it not as important? Or how do you see that if you were president? Tax policy is going to be one of those things that never ends in the discussion of presidential politics.
I think you really need a portfolio that mixes these things. So part of the idea of the NEA and arts funding federally is that at a very, very, very modest level, you take some of what does come in through taxes and you push it into our communities and use it in that way. But you would also want to see a tax policy that incentivizes people to make contributions. Maybe find a way that it's no less favorable to the kinds of modest day-by-day contributions that, as you say, are what keeps the civic theater at home.
The operational running. Parts of it.
Yeah, because you can't put your name on that quite as easily, right? Yeah. So it's harder to raise. It's always easier to raise money for the big thing that you can name a building after, or a bench after, a theater after. Tougher to have that kind of day-in, day-out support, but obviously vital. And then we also need to call on community members, of course, to step up. And that's been the saving grace, where it has gone well, is that we've found organizations, entities, companies, individuals ready to chip in. But you want to have a sense that this is also a kind of a national project, that we as a whole take pride in what we're doing in the arts, and that means investing in it. Now, the other challenge you have is, by its nature, the arts generate things that you don't always have a consensus around their value, right? That's kind of the point. In fact,
my wife and I talk about that a lot, about what we like, what we don't.
Yeah, look, there's a lot of, when you make sure there's a lot of public art, you're going to get some bad public art, at least to your own taste, right? That's part of the point. And we recognize that in other fields. We understand that in the business community, not every business is going to work out. We understand that, certain policy choices will be controversial, but somehow there's this idea that, every bit of art that we fund has to be something that all of us agree is good and valuable, and it doesn't work that way. You got to throw some stuff out there and create the space for people, especially because it's almost a cliche that a lot of great art is not appreciated in its time, right? All the more reason that you need to create something besides the tastes of the day or the tastes of the well-resourced that gets some resources out there for people to experiment with and play with and learn from.
From the national service perspective that you sort of hit on a little bit, we've been talking about the idea that's out there, a little bit of a sort of a creative artist core to use art as successful and not. I mean, there's so many college kids, probably around your age was the time that I started to realize that kids picking me up at the airport were no longer the generation playing their demo tapes to be millionaires. They were more talking about being music therapists. Yeah, it was interesting because you were used to that. Like 1995, some kid picked me up from the airport, and it's going to be like, hey, man, listen to my tape. I'm going to be a millionaire. 10 years later, it really was a lot about maybe some a cappella stuff sometimes, which I find that community really just interestingly volunteer oriented, and I would rope them in immediately because they're ready to go sing. Plus, they're probably ready to go door to door and build things and do stuff and use that artistic symbol of harmony working together and actually show it to be true in real life. But have you has this been something that's been in your periphery at all? People talking about an artist corps, and I don't think it's been fleshed out at all. It's just a word so far. How do you see that working?
Well, there is a precedent for that, right? I mean, some of what you saw out of those New Deal programs was in the creative space, and I'm a big fan of national service. I'm talking about it everywhere I go, largely because I think I think back to my time in the military, and when I was deployed, I learned how to trust my life to people who were not like me, whose politics I did not care for. Right? I mean, you working together on something hard generates a kind of bond that is in short supply right now in this country. And as we continue to get fragmented and divided and pitted against each other, I often think back to my time in Afghanistan, where I was with people from radically different backgrounds, and we learned under that pressure to work well together and to trust each other. And because we actually learned to trust each other before we learned to like each other, but one leads to the other. I guess the way I feel is you shouldn't have to go to war to have that kind of experience. And so the thought behind national service is not just that there's a lot of projects out there waiting to be done, but also just that in the doing them, there's a lot of value. And so it doesn't all have to be military. And when we think about expanding a Peace Corps and AmeriCorps and City Year and all these opportunities, I haven't heard as much conversation about a kind of creative core or creative element to that, but it makes a ton of sense. I mean, this is all about harnessing what is in people that makes them great. Yeah.
Getting them engaged in their own community in some way.
Yeah, and then inviting them to see value in it, right? And deliver value for others, which is really at this moment when we have kind of a crisis, I think also of not just of unity, but kind of a crisis of belonging or identity. Especially because it's less and less the case that you can establish your identity through a lifelong relationship with a single employer, right? Our society is just less and less set up that way. It's a real problem because when somebody wants to ask the question, who are you? Usually they do it by saying, what do you do? And, of course, if you're my age or younger, you're going to be changing professions more often than my parents changed jobs, right? So it's harder and harder to anchor your identity in your job. Now, what's really interesting, traditionally and historically, about people in the creative world is it's not at all unusual for a musician or an actor or a painter to have an identity based on that work that's totally different from their day job, right? I mean, just even the cliche story that your day job is you're waiting tables in Hollywood and your identity is you're an actor, right? Or the way that musicians, especially early in a career of even the most successful performers and artists, is that they have a very clear sense of identity that doesn't hinge on how they make a living. And so we can learn from that as we're looking for other sources of identity and purpose and community that can glue us together when the workplace may just not be doing that for us anymore. They could be very healthy and could rush to fill that void before other much uglier things do, like from substance abuse to violence, which is where some people wind up when they don't have some other way of expressing and consolidating their identity and their sense of purpose.
Yeah. As mayor, I know, for example, when I was mayor of Anchorage, we expanded our museum. And that expansion alone created this economic domino effect. We set that up, then restaurants opened and other places opened and stores opened, and it became an economic engine. Do you think when you talk about the arts, not only the impact into the person themselves, but is there an argument that can be made or a discussion point that can be made that investing in the arts, and I use the word investing, is a way to also move an economy or take a part of a community that maybe needs some revitalization? Does arts have a play in that, or are we always in this kind of positioning that, that's extra?
Yeah.
Or is it really an investment that can change a community or bring in more business? Yeah. Your thoughts on the economic connection to the arts?
Yeah, I think we've got to illustrate how important that is. I think about it from the perspective of attraction, right? So every mayor's trying to get business. And the old model was you cut a deal with tax breaks, you land the big factory, and that's how you're going to get the jobs and prove you're a good mayor. And, sometimes we do. I mean, we definitely still use incentives and we still do attraction. But what I'm finding is, by the time when there's, for example, an attraction opportunity and the CEO, this rarely actually happens, but sometimes it does. The CEO's coming to town, he's sizing up your community and 2 other competitors and wants to see it, right? Well, by the time they've shown up, they've done the math around land, labor, utilities, taxes, and the rest of it. You've computed your incentives. You've figured all of that out. They're there to see what kind of community it is, because companies are made of people. And they're thinking, okay, where am I going to be able to recruit people to? Is there a good quality of place here? Mm-hmm. Not just quality of life, but quality of place. Mm-hmm. Is this a place where my kids and my employees' kids are going to thrive? Is going to be a good look that we're here and not somewhere else. And a lot of that has to do with culture. And so when you're making an investment in the culture of a place, that's also going to benefit you economically. It's going to benefit you in terms of growth. And what we've got to do is have those kind of more practical conversations. And at the same time, have the other conversation that this isn't just a means to an end, that it's also just intrinsically valuable, that just human beings, in the same way that human beings ought to have safety and human beings ought to have food and health, human beings ought to have access to creativity for their own expression. Yeah, exactly. It's part of what it is to be human, and it's valuable in itself. But it's both. That's the point. It's both. And so it's all the more reason for us to do it.
If we had an hour, it would be fun to just ask you go back to critical thinking and education and art's place in critical thinking. Because I think a lot of people use the word, but don't really have a lot of understanding of what critical thinking is, including myself. But I'm interested because I find that music and art in general is probably first and foremost about communication. And like when I mentioned that you're a very future-speaking person and candidate without using the word a lot. And that strikes me as inherently artistic. It's inherently poetic because you have a way of describing it, putting someone there poetically and saying, oh, okay, now I can imagine old Pete in this year and what's happened and where am I and are my kids still alive and all these things. And it actually puts you there. If you say just simply, in the future, looking forward, that's all you say, it doesn't mean anything to people. So I guess to go back to if we had an hour or so, how do you put together the importance of art in education and in critical thinking? How does that work for you?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. We could explore this for hours, but a couple of quick thoughts. One is that what's going to be more and more important as we go, I think, is recognizing patterns. And thinking about what happens when patterns get broken. And that's true whether you're on a shop floor and you're doing quality control, which is the one part of a production line that's harder to automate, and you need to respond when something's coming off the line in an odd way. And it's true when you're just a voter trying to figure out what to do when the kind of economic patterns we've relied on for our whole lives are being broken, and how are we supposed to respond to that politically. And so it's one thing I think a lot about in music, for example. Music is about pattern. A key change arouses a certain feeling in you because one pattern is being broken and another one's being established. But there's also something about just the ability to relate to another human being. Maybe that tracks with what you're saying about communication. That is incredibly important politically, because most social and political evil happens when somebody regards another human being or a category of human beings as something other than people. And most social and political good comes from us looking at the interests of others and identifying them, caring about them as much as we do our own. And what a song, a piece of creative visual art, a performance, a novel can do is make you think of something that is outside of your experience as your own. It's putting yourself in somebody's head. And it's what good political rhetoric does too. But if I give a good speech, I'm bringing, as you say, I'm bringing somebody into that world.
Right.
And I am convinced that it is, while it is certainly possible with political rhetoric, and I'm afraid for that matter perhaps with creative rhetoric, it is certainly possible to make people feel small and divided and therefore protective and backward-looking and closed. I'm also convinced that it's possible to use these tools, even speech itself, to make people feel secure and big-hearted and forward-looking and generous. And it's one of the reasons I do this, is because I believe in that capability. What maybe above all art shows us, from film to song, is that we really can put ourselves in the shoes of another human being. And when we do that, we in the political space, then we are ready to actually make good on what we all know vaguely but rarely walk the walk of, which is that we all do better when we all do better, and we got to make somebody better off in order to live in a country, a city, a community, a family that actually works.
Mayor, we're at the end of our podcast, but I wanted to ask you kind of a fun question. So let's assume for a moment you have no worries in the world. You have nothing. You're a free person. You can do anything you want. What's the artist, actor, musician that you would love to be?
Oh, that is interesting. I think if I were a better... unfortunately, I'm not talented enough to be a novelist. But
you
if
get
I
all
could,
the talent of that person.
Then I'd totally be a novelist. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess if I could do what Joyce did for the form of the novel, but I don't know where else you would take it. So I guess it's been done. But certainly that kind of work, I would love to. I suppose become a great actor, or just to master a form, any form, and maybe hopefully I'll be able to say someday that I've come as close as you can to mastery of the form I work in, which is politics, but
which is an art
or government. Absolutely is. But the idea, Jimi Hendrix, the way he just mastered the fingerboard of a guitar,
right,
and just made it do things that people didn't think was possible, and there was a direct. Other people can learn to play. The technical and difficult as they are, you can learn how to move your fingers as fast as he did. But there was such a mastery there that things were coming out of his mind and out of his emotions that expressed themselves effortlessly in a guitar, that it would just be beautiful to have that capacity.
I'm visualizing you on a stage right now.
With a bandana.
Yeah. I'm looking at the guitar behind his head. So, well, this is fantastic, Mayor Pete. Thank you very much for being part of this. And obviously, Ben Folds, as always, doing the Americans for Arts Action Fund podcast. It's a great chance to add something to the presidential campaign that usually you don't hear on the stage in a way, but you giving your time today was very appreciative. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Be sure to subscribe today to the ArtsVote 2020 podcast series with Ben Folds on Anchor or any of your favorite podcast apps. Please go to artsactionfund.org/podcast for more info. That's artsactionfund.org/podcast. You'll get more info.